It was Christmas Eve on Lonesome Mountain, but no one on the mountain knew that it was, although any child who lived in the outside world could have easily told you. But here on Lonesome Mountain, there was a deafening silence in the gray twilight that comes only on Christmas Eve. The only sounds were the big flakes of snow that fell from the heavens, as they never fell on any other day except Christmas Eve. In the distance, there was a cold, snowy man on horseback in a big, heavy coat. The mountain man's name was Hiram, and to see his saddlebags on his horse, one might have thought that they were bursting with toys for children in the little cabin that laid straight ahead at the mouth of No Business Creek. But not even Hiram knew that it was Christmas Eve. But he had heavy thoughts on his mind, and he had been reminiscing of Christmas Eve from the previous year, when he was locked away in Brushy Mountain Prison with 100 other men in stripes. It was then that they gathered in the walled-in prison yard laced with barbed wire, and they listened to a preacher talk of peace in the world and how there ought to be goodwill to all men upon earth. But in Hiram's mind, that might be true for all men, except for one, and for that man, Hiram had nothing but hatred in his heart for him. But back in that prison, the preacher man shouted, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." That was what the man of God had thundered at Hiram. And even though exactly 1 year had passed, nothing had changed in Hiram's mind, and he still thought of the one man that he hated, that scoundrel who had betrayed him to the law and took away Hiram's liberty and had robbed him of everything in life except the furious longing for the day when he could strike back. Oh, and he would strike to kill. And in the present, while he splashed through the yellow mud, thinking of last Christmas Eve, Hiram shook his head and gritted his teeth. No, vengeance is mine. The big flakes continued to fall, attaching themselves to the naked trees, twigs, and limbs until it decorated them in a pure white blanket. They also gathered on the brim of Hiram's slouch hat and filled out the wrinkles in his big coat and whitened his hair and his long mustache and beard and sifted into the yellow, twisting path that guided his horse's feet. High above, he could see through the whirling snow, now and then, the gleam of a flickering light. He knew that it was the light from his enemy's window, but somehow that preacher's voice kept ringing in his ears, and every time he saw that light, he couldn't help but to think of the story of the star that the preacher had told him last Christmas Eve. Now, Hiram dropped his eyes as not to see it again, but he rode on until that light shone on his face. Then he led his horse up a little ravine and hitched it to a chestnut tree amongst the snowy holly and mountain laurel, and then the mountaineer slipped towards the light. That dog was in there somewhere, and like a thief, Hiram climbed over the split rail fence and stole through the tall, snow-wet grass until he leaned against an apple tree with the sill of the window 2 feet above the level of his eyes. Reaching above him, he caught hold of a stout limb and dragged himself up into a fork of the tree. A mass of snow slipped softly to the earth, and the branch creaked above the light wind. Hiram had waited 3 long years, and he had ridden 2 hard nights and laid out 2 cold days in the forest for this. And now he reached out very carefully and noiselessly and broke away leaf and branch until a passage was cleared for his eye and for the point of his pistol that was gripped in his right hand. A woman was just disappearing through a kitchen door as he peered cautiously and saw nothing but darting shadows. From one corner, a shadow loomed suddenly, seemed to be a human shape. Hiram could see the shadow gesture of an arm, and he cocked his pistol. That shadow must surely be his man, and in a moment, he'd be in his chair in front of that fireplace to smoke his pipe, maybe his last pipe. Hiram smiled. Pure hatred made him smile, but it was a low-down, mean and sorry thing to do to shoot a man in the back, even a sorry dog like this one. But now that the moment had come, a wave of sickening shame ran through Hiram. No one from his family had ever shot a man in the back before. But this man and his people had, and with their own lips, they had framed Hiram. What was fair for one was fair for the other one, is what they always said. A poor man couldn't fight money in the courts, and so they had shot from the brush. And that's why they were rich now, and Hiram was poor. And that's why his enemy was safe at home, and Hiram was out here, homeless, in an apple tree. Hiram thought of all this, but it was no use. The shadows slouched suddenly and disappeared, and Hiram was glad. With a gritting oath between his chattering teeth, he pulled his pistol back into his coat and thrust one leg down to swing from the tree. Yeah, he'd meet him face to face the next day and kill him like a man. And there he hung, as rigid as the cold had suddenly turned all his blood, bones, and marrow into ice. Back inside the cabin, a door opened, and there, standing in the firelight, was a girl who he had heard was dead while he was in prison. But it was only now, in this moment, that he realized why he was told this. It was a lie. You see, this woman had once been the love of Hiram's life, and now she was the wife of the man he meant to kill. He stared in disbelief, watching through the window as her lips moved. He thought he could tell what she was saying.
"Get up, little Jim, get up. It's time for bed. Now come on now."
And then she went back, despite being nearly frozen from the bitter winter cold. A flame flared within Hiram. Oh, it burned so hot that it must have come straight from the devil's forge. Again, the shadows played over the ceiling. His teeth grated as he cocked his pistol and pointed it inside the window and waited for Jim to reappear. The shadow of a head emerged among the rafters, and over the fireplace, Hiram was suddenly a madman, clutching the butt of his pistol. And as his eye caught the glinting sight, his heart pounded in his chest as he tried to steady his aim, ready to fire. But in that moment, there stepped into the square light of the window a small child. It was a boy with yellow curly hair, and he had a puppy in his arms. And there in front of the fire, the little fellow dropped the dog, and they began to play. Hiram could hear the shrill barking of the fat little dog and the joyous shrieks of the boy as that pup chased his tail round and round, which resulted in the furball toppling over on the floor. This was the first child that Hiram had seen in 3 years, and they were down on the floor now, rolling over and over together. And he watched them until the child grew tired and turned his face to the fire and laid still, looking into it. Hiram could see the boy's eyes growing sleepy, and then the puppy crept closer and put his head on his playmate's chest, and there in front of the fireplace, the two best friends fell asleep. And still Hiram looked, his clasp loosening on his pistol and his lips loosening underneath his stiff mustache, and kept looking until the bedroom door opened again, and the woman made her way across the main room until she opened the door leading to outside. A flood of light flashed suddenly on the snow, barely touching the snow-hung tips of the apple tree. And there she stood in the open doorway, looking anxiously into the darkness, almost as if she had a premonition that someone was there, before she slowly went back inside the warm cabin, closing the door. Hiram dropped noiselessly to the snow as she closed the door. He wanted so bad to tell her that he was there, and that he only stopped writing because they had told her that she was dead. Oh, he had never stopped thinking about her. And the truth was, he still loved her. He wondered what she would think when she saw his tracks in the snow the next morning. And then he realized that time marches on. Her feelings for him had probably slowly disappeared, much like his tracks would by morning.
Get someone you love the gift of old-fashioned storytelling. 2 volumes packed with stories that'll make your heart smile. Visit theappalachianchannel.com to pick up your copy today.
with the weight of the world upon his shoulders, all depending on whether or not he would indeed pull the trigger and kill the man who had stolen everything from him. Hiram started up the ravine, back to where his horse was. But just then, he heard the clink of metal coming down the trail in the darkness, and then the splash of horses' hooves in the soft mud. Someone was approaching the cabin. Hiram sank down and watched from behind a laurel thicket. As the horse approached, the stranger's face slowly became visible, and there was no mistaking about that face. It was the man that Hiram had been looking for. Rage fell over Hiram, and he pulled his pistol and cocked it and aimed it at the approaching man's head. It was time for vengeance. Now he would pay for all he had stole from Hiram. Again, the light from the cabin flashed out on the snow, and the woman stepped out of the cabin. Time stood still for a moment as Hiram watched the beautiful woman walk towards him. Oh, she had a radiant smile on her face. She was almost glowing with love. In Hiram's heart, he hoped in vain that she would call out to him and beg him not to leave. But it was all only a fantasy. The woman's voice cheerfully called out as she saw her husband approaching on horseback.
Jim, I'm so glad you're home. I was getting worried about you. You know I hate it when you stay out so late, and little Jim is already in his nightgown and sound asleep, and I've got some hot cornbread and soup beans waiting for you.
Just then, the sleeping boy emerged barefooted, running towards his father, with his puppy's ears flopping as he ran behind the boy. "Daddy's home! Daddy's home!" And then the child fell into his father's arms for a giant, firm hug. The hated man carried his young son in one arm, with his other arm wrapped tightly around his wife, who had her head tenderly laid across his chest. And together, they all walked towards Hiram. His pistol was shaking in his hands as he fought with heaven and hell in his heart. Something more powerful than him kept him from pulling the trigger as the trio disappeared into the safety of the warm cabin. Jim had narrowly passed death, which was waiting for him behind the bush. Only once, far down the dark forest, and only God knows why, but only once did Hiram look back. There was the red light gleaming in the window, faintly through the moonlit flakes of snow. Once more, he thought of the prison preacher's words, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." The cabin light slowly disappeared as Hiram rode away into the darkness. Not one soul on Lonesome Mountain, not even Hiram, knew that it was Christmas Eve.